What's up, Internet?
Jordan here from Arrow to the Mead. Today, we're going to be seeing if I can follow a Reddit recipe for my first ever braggot. Let's get to it. So overall, I would probably consider myself an intermediate level brewer, but I have zero experience whatsoever with braggots, or beer for that matter. Braggot's a brew with both honey and grain, kind of a combination of mead and beer, and it's just something that's brand new to me. I tried to poke around at the style a little bit and get a better sense for what's out there, what you can do with it, and I just didn't really know what I wanted. One of the recommendations I received was to go check out the Reddit wiki and look for a braggot recipe just to have somewhere to start. So that's what I did. I also want to say that a caveat with this whole thing is that I did not ask for help at any point in the process. I just did my best to follow the wiki instructions as written. That is not how you should do it at home if you're going to try. I can guarantee you, 100% guarantee you, that if you ask on the subreddit or on the Mead Hall Discord, you can get help with these recipes. You might even be able to get a hold of the person who wrote the recipes, because a lot of them are still active and hang around on the subreddit or the Discord or wherever else. I just thought it would be an interesting test of my brewing skills to see if I could figure out the recipe as written. Anyway, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's take a look at the recipe I chose. I settled on the Elderflower Braggot, and for the most part, I did my best to stay really true to the recipe and the instructions it came with. The main intentional change that I made to the recipe was simply scaling it down from 5 gallons to 3. That said, the 3-gallon size was 100% a limitation of the amount of space I have available and the number of fully vaccinated drinking friends that are available to help me work through 5 gallons of homebrew. I am in no way recommending or endorsing 3 gallons for this particular batch. 5 gallons is frankly vastly superior. A lot of the ingredients you're going to need are pre-packaged in exactly the size that you're going to need for a 5-gallon batch. If you do 3 gallons, it's a lot more work, a lot more measuring, and a lot more room for human error, which I may or may not have learned the hard way. So, that all said, I'm basically going to pretend that I brewed this as a 5-gallon batch. I'm going to refer to all of the ingredients by their 5-gallon volumes or weights, not by what I technically used. For full transparency, I will put my 3-gallon variation up on the screen in this next part, but it'll just be easier for you to cross-reference this with the wiki page if you want to try brewing it for yourself, if I refer to it by the same volumes that are listed there. Alrighty, that weird explanation out of the way, let's actually get on to the recipe itself. It calls for 3 pounds of honey. Varietal was not specified, so I just went with the clover honey that I purchased in bulk and still had in stock. 3 pounds of gold liquid malt extract, a pound of elderflower, 3 ounces of heather, an ounce of golding hops. And then this wasn't technically listed in the ingredient section, but if you look at the steps in the instructions, there are 2 places where it asks you to add 2 gallons of water. Moving on to nutrition and other powders, the recipe calls for 12.5 grams of Go Firm to rehydrate your yeast with, 8.5 grams of Fermade O, 4.9 grams of Fermade K, and 40 grams of bentonite, which for those of you who are unfamiliar is a fining agent. For the yeast, I'm going to mispronounce this horribly, Lalamand Windsor, the recipe calls for 10 grams. From there, we're on to the process, and for the most part, I did my best to stick to the instructions that were provided with the recipe. As a result, the first step was to begin rehydrating my yeast. I looked ahead at the process a little bit and realized that there were multiple steps that were going to take 20 minutes or 30 minutes, and the instructions on my Go Firm actually say to rehydrate for 15 to 30 minutes. So I made the executive decision to begin the rehydration process by dissolving my Go Firm in hot water, but then just moving on to the next step in the process while I waited for that Go Firm solution to cool down to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the temperature at which you're supposed to add yeast to your Go Firm solution. I checked the temperature on that Go Firm solution periodically as I moved on through the other steps in this process, and when we eventually hit 104 degrees Fahrenheit, I went ahead and added the yeast in. While that was cooling, I moved on to the next step, which was to add the gold malt extract and 2 gallons of water to my brew kettle and bring them to a boil. Once I got a good solid boil going, I yeeted the hops in and set a timer for 20 minutes. While that timer was going, I checked ahead a couple steps and realized I was going to need 2 gallons of cold water in the near future. So I sanitized a container, filled it up with filtered water, and stuck it in the freezer. Then I prepped both the elderflower and the heather. by weighing them out to the appropriate amounts for my brew. I used a secondary brew kettle just to hold a brew bag open so that I could easily pour them in after I weighed them out. I do want to point out that this is a slight deviation from the original instructions. See, technically, you're supposed to have a different brew bag for both the heather and the elderflower, so that later on in the process, you can remove them individually when you are satisfied with the amount of flavor extraction that you have achieved from each individual herb. I didn't have 2 brew bags available in appropriate sizes, so I just put them both in the same big bag. I certainly don't think this is going to ruin the brew or anything, but it will leave me with less granular control over my flavor profile, and I wanted to point that out. When the 20-minute timer was up, I added the brew bag with my herbs in it and set another timer for 30 minutes. The instructions at this point say to turn the heat off, but also to make sure that the heat stays above 150 degrees Fahrenheit. I checked in on it a little bit early on and found out that it seemed like it was cooling off a little too quick. I know from personal experience with my specific stovetop, that particular brew kettle, and with must volumes of approximately that size, that on the lowest heat setting, I could probably expect it to hover around 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So I ended up being kind of lazy and just leaving it on the lowest setting for most of the 30 minutes. While the herbs were steeping, I again checked ahead to the next steps and decided it would be best to prep for them by weighing out the honey and bentonite. And when that 30-minute rest was finished, it was time to dump the boil into my primary fermenter. And this is also where things got a little weird on me. The instructions at this step call for the addition of 2 gallons of cold water and the 3 pounds of honey. That, combined with the earlier 2 gallons of water and 3 gallons of malt extract, plus a pound and change of herbs, I figured that the intent was for the total volume at this point to be right around 5 gallons. Or in my scaled down version, 3 gallons. But I had volume markings on the side of my bucket and I could tell that I was going to come up short. I decided to take a gravity measurement in addition to checking the temperature of my must so that I could temperature correct for the 60 degree Fahrenheit calibration temperature of my hydrometer, and then get to running some calculations. I had to putz around with a few different types of homebrew calculators, but I eventually determined that if I brought the total volume of my must right up to 3 gallons, and I assume the same would be true if you were bringing it up to 5 gallons, that I would be right about on the nose of the 1042 original gravity listed in the wiki recipe. I'm still not really sure if I missed a step, or if I calculated the scaled down amount of water I was supposed to add wrong, or if I boiled off too much water on accident or what. But given how perfectly the intended original gravity and the total volume lined up together, I was almost certain that the right thing to do was to top off to 3 gallons here. So that's what I did. With that sorted, at least hopefully, I added the missing water, then my bentonite, continued mixing it up real good with my drill stir, and then took another gravity measurement and checked the temperature of my must so that I could double check and make sure that I was on target for my original gravity. Luckily it worked out and I was right spot on the 1042 I was aiming for according to the wiki, so I'm pretty sure I got this part right. But let me know down in the comments what you think. In any case, by the time this was all done, the must had cooled down enough that it was at a pitchable temperature, so I went ahead and added the yeast, officially starting fermentation. Technically, the instructions advise following an SNA nutrient schedule over the first 1/3 of primary fermentation. But because the starting gravity is only 1042, I felt like it was a little bit too low for me to easily implement that, and I ended up basically just waiting long enough for the airlock to start bubbling before I pitched all of my nutrients. That might not be ideal, but in my experience, it's fairly common practice to front-load nutrients when the starting gravity is that low. Either way, that's all there is to this brew for now. I'll follow up with another video on the second half of the process and let you know how it goes. Until then, this has been Jordan from Arrow to the Mead. Thank you for joining me, and have a good however long until I see you again.